Whitmore Estate Auction, Claremont, Indiana, Thursday in March. Tate Callum stood near the folding table at the back of the room, coffee going cold in his hand, eyes on the lot at the far end of the floor. A clock, or what was left of one. The case was warped along the base, the glass door cracked clean through, the finial missing from the top, and whoever had stored it last had done so somewhere damp. 3 appraisers had walked past it during the preview without stopping. When the bidding opened and Tate's hand went up, the room shifted. Not loudly, worse than loudly, with the particular quiet that means people are exchanging looks. A man 2 rows forward, gray blazer, the kind of watch that cost more than Tate's truck, leaned toward the woman beside him and said something that made her laugh. Tate heard his own name in it, or thought he did. He kept his hand up. The woman running the auction, standing at the portable podium with a yellow legal pad, and the focused expression of someone who has done this 200 times, looked at him. Her name was Priya Lund, and she had been working Whitmore's regional circuit for 6 years, and she did not laugh. She took his bid. Nobody else raised a hand. She brought the gavel down. No one in that room knew that 42 days later, the same clock would be standing in a different building entirely. And nobody would be quiet in the same way. 2 nights before the Whitmore auction, Tate had been at the kitchen table helping his daughter with long division when the estate notification came through on his phone. He subscribed to 8 regional auction alerts. The kind of professional habit that rarely turned into anything. He'd set the phone face down and gone back to the math worksheet. Sophie finished the last problem wrong, erased it, got it wrong again, and then looked at him with the particular expression she'd been deploying since she was 4, patient and slightly mournful, like she'd been expecting this difficulty all along. He fixed the problem with her. They did 3 more. Then he put her to bed and came back to the table and picked up his phone. He almost didn't open the attachment. He did. The photos were poor, 2 of them, taken with a phone in low light, the kind of pictures that said the photographer was there to document, not to impress. Tate scrolled past the first photo and stopped at the second. It was angled low, catching the base of the clock case from below. He pinched the image open with 2 fingers and looked at the corner joint, where the bracket feet met the case body. He sat still for a long time. Then he went to his workbench in the converted half of the garage, turned on the magnifying lamp and printed the photo on the small color printer he kept. For reference images, he put it under the lamp and looked at the dovetail angle, the depth of the cove molding, the way the bracket feet attached, not pinned, which was common, but with a particular threaded fitting he had seen in exactly 4 other clocks in his life, and all 4 had come out of the same workshop. He called his sister in Columbus and asked if she could take Sophie for the weekend. In the morning he drove Sophie to school in the truck with the cracked dashboard. She was in the back seat reading a book and eating a granola bar simultaneously, which was something she did without apparent difficulty. "Where are you going this weekend?" she asked without looking up from the book. "Indiana. There's a clock I want to look at." Sophie turned a page. "Is it a good clock or a broken clock?" Tate thought about it honestly. "Both." She considered this. "Those are usually worth looking at," she said, with the confidence of a 9-year-old who had spent most of her life in a workshop and had opinions about it. She went back to her book. The preview at Whitmore ran from 10 to noon. Tate arrived at 10:15 and walked the room slowly, the way he always did, not head directly to the thing he'd come for. The floor held 22 lots, Victorian parlor furniture, depression glass, a set of oil paintings that might be interesting to someone, a good mantel clock in a mahogany case, not what he'd come for but worth noting, and at the far end of the room on a folding table with a paper lot tag taped to the base, the clock. He walked past it once. Then he circled back and crouched in front of it and clicked on the small flashlight he kept clipped to his jacket pocket. The movement was not visible without opening the case, and the case was locked, but the access panel in the base had a hairline gap that let him angle the light in. What he could see confirmed part of what he thought. The motion work, the small set of gears that drove the hands, was arranged in a configuration he recognized. Not the common configuration. Not the one you'd find in 90% of English bracket clocks from this period. The one used by a single workshop in Bristol for approximately 18 years in the mid-18th century, before the maker died without apprentices, and the method died with him. Tate stood up, clicked off the light, and wiped his hands on his jeans. The man in the gray blazer was passing behind him. His name was Harmon Fitch, and Tate recognized him from the regional circuit, old money, deep pockets, and the particular confidence of someone who had been the smartest person in most rooms he'd entered. Fitch glanced at Tate. He glanced at the clock. He said something to the woman beside him and they moved on. At the podium, Priya Lund was going through her lot documentation with a pen and a highlighter, making notes with the focused efficiency of someone who did not waste motion. She almost missed it. The man in the work jacket crouched over lot 19 with a flashlight. Almost. She made a note on her bidder sheet. Callum T., registration 23. Then she went back to her work and wasn't entirely sure why she'd bothered. When lot 19 came up, Priya set the opening low. It was that kind of lot condition issues, incomplete provenance, the sort of item that attracted specialists or nobody. She called for an opening bid twice. Tate's hand went up in the back of the room. The room shifted the way rooms shift when something registers as wrong, without anyone being able to say exactly what. There was a pause, and then the quiet, and Harmon Fitch's voice came through without any particular effort, directed at the man next to him but audible to the row ahead. Something about a project for a man with more hope than sense. Priya looked at Tate. He was looking at the clock. No other bids came in. She brought the gavel down. When he stepped forward to sign the receipt, they were briefly in the same sightline. Her looking up from the form, him waiting with his pen. Neither of them said anything particular. She wrote his number in the column and handed him his copy, and he folded it into his jacket pocket and went to arrange transport. She watched him go. Then she looked back at her legal pad and put a small mark beside lot 19 that she couldn't have fully explained if someone had asked. Tate got the clock home on a Monday. He set it on the center of the main work table in the shop, the half of the garage he'd converted 6 years ago. When it became clear that the repair work was going to be more than a side project, and that the dining room table wasn't going to survive as a workshop, he stood back and looked at it under the overhead light with his arms crossed. The damage was real. The case needed significant work. The warped base, the cracked glass, the missing finial. Cosmetic, mostly, but time-consuming. The movement was questionable. He unlocked the access panel and opened the case. He stood very still for about a minute. Then, he sat down on the shop stool and put both hands flat on the table and looked at the movement for another minute without touching it. His neighbor, a retired man named Everett Pugh, who spent most days in his own garage, 3 houses down, and had taken to wandering over, periodically without strong justification, appeared in the doorway holding a thermos. "You found something," Everett said. "Bought something." Everett came in and looked at the clock movement from a respectful distance. He'd been in the workshop enough years to know what he was looking at, even when he didn't know what he was looking at. "I take it that's significant. The movement is attributed to a maker named Josiah Farwell. Bristol, active roughly 1748 to 1766. Tate picked up his loupe and leaned in. The configuration of the motion work is specific to his shop. No one replicated it after he died because no one knew precisely how it worked. It took a horological historian named Pratt about 40 years of research to reconstruct the method, and his paper on it was published in a journal that most auction houses don't read. Everett looked at the clock. What does that mean in terms of numbers? If the attribution holds and the movement is in working condition, which I believe it is, and if I can get the provenance documented correctly, this goes to Christie's or Bonham's at somewhere between 200 and 400,000. Everett made a sound. "And you paid," Tate told him. Everett sat down on the second stool. "The casework I can do myself," Tate said. "The movement I can assess, but I need a third-party horological expert to sign off on the attribution. That's the piece." He paused. "And I need the documentation chain going back as far as possible." 6 weeks, Everett said. 42 days, if I don't take weekends. "You have a daughter. She comes to the shop on Thursdays." Everett unscrewed the thermos cap and poured coffee into it and set the cup next to Tate's hand. "You're going to need that," he said and went home. That afternoon, Priya called Whitmore's records office to confirm the payment processing on lot 19. Standard follow-up. She handled 4 other calls after that, and then sat at her desk and looked at the lot file. Bidder 23. She opened a browser tab and typed the name and the city. A business website. Sparse, updated irregularly. A few photographs of completed restorations. that were good enough to be arresting even on a slow internet connection. 3 lines of text describing the services, reviews that said things like meticulous and knows things most people don't. She closed the tab. She did not close the window. The first week was disassembly and assessment. Tate worked from 6 in the morning until the shop got too cold, which in March in Ohio was around 10 at night. He ate at the workbench. He took calls from suppliers in Connecticut and Pennsylvania between work intervals. He found a source for period-appropriate veneer in a shop in Baltimore that had a small stock they'd been holding since the 1990s and didn't fully understand the value of. He ordered it without negotiating. Sophie came on Thursday. She dropped her backpack behind the parts cabinet, spun twice on the wheeled stool, and pulled out her homework. She did not talk while she was working, which she had learned from watching her father. After 20 minutes or so, she looked up. What does it sound like when it works? Tate was under the magnifying lamp examining the escapement. Something between a heartbeat and a clock. Once you hear it, you don't forget it. Sophie thought about this. How old is it? Approximately 270 years. She was quiet for a moment. And it still works. That's what I'm trying to establish. Another pause. That's kind of like you, she said, and went back to her homework. Tate set down the loop and looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he picked it back up. On the 8th day, a car pulled into the driveway that wasn't Everett's. Priya Lund came in with a padfolio and the measured expression of a person who has a professional reason for being somewhere and is prepared to explain it. Tate opened the side door wider and said, "Come in," without asking why she was there. She explained that Whitmore liked to track the disposition of specialty lots in the first 30 days. Condition documentation, intended use, that kind of information. It informed their cataloging for similar items going forward. She said all of it in a tone that suggested routine, which was partially but not entirely true, and both of them registered this without saying so. The clock was partially disassembled on the center table. The movement was out of the case, sitting on a padded surface under the lamp. The case was propped against the back wall with the veneer work half done. Priya looked at the movement. "May I? Don't touch it. But look." She leaned in. She was quiet for a moment. "The motion work configuration is unusual." Tate looked at her. "The wheel placement," she said, straightening. "I took a course in horological appraisal at the AAA Institute 4 years ago. We spent 1 session on English bracket movement typology. 1 session. Enough to know that what I'm looking at isn't standard." He told her what it was. He said it plainly, without performance, the way he explained things when he'd explained them before but was explaining again because someone had earned the explanation. He told her about Farwell and the Bristol attribution and the Pratt paper and what the configuration meant. Priya listened. She was writing some of it down. She stopped writing at a certain point and just listened. "Do you plan to bring it back to auction?" she asked. "Depends on the documentation." She wrote that down. It was the technically correct answer to what she'd asked, and also something adjacent to a different answer. And she noticed both. When she left, she looked back once. He had already turned back to the movement, the lamp warm and yellow behind him. She sat in her car for a moment before starting it. Then she opened the padfolio and wrote, "Bidder 23. Specialist knowledge confirmed. Attribution in progress." She underlined the last 3 words. Then she stared at what she'd written longer than was strictly professional. Word got back to Harmon Fitch around day 12, the way it always does in regional auction circles. Someone mentioned it at a club lunch. Someone else had driven past the address. A third party had heard something secondhand and passed it along as fact. The mechanic with the junkyard clock was apparently doing something serious with it. Harmon had left the first time. Then he'd made a call. The man he sent was named Whitfield. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with a business card from Fitch Acquisitions and a prepared offer framed as a favor. He wanted to save Tate the trouble of a second auction, the fees, the uncertainty. He was pleasant about it. He was practiced. The clock was covered under a cloth in the back of the shop. Tate came out from behind the parts cabinet and stood between Whitfield and the cloth. "Not for sale," Tate said, before Whitfield had finished his introduction. Whitfield tried 3 more angles. Fair market. Convenience. The difficulty of provenance documentation for items without clear chain of title. During all of it, he kept his eyes moving toward the covered shape at the back of the room. "Not for sale," Tate said again. Whitfield left. Tate watched his car back out of the driveway and disappear. That evening, Harmon called Priya directly. He had her number because she'd given it to him 3 years ago when he was one of Whitmore's best clients and she was still calibrating where the lines were. He was friendly in the way people are friendly when they expect to be accommodated. He wanted to know if there was anything in the lot file, previous ownership history, any seller documentation, anything Whitmore had on record. Priya said that was internal to the auction house, and she wasn't able to share it. Harmon mentioned that Fitch Acquisitions had processed nearly $300,000 through Whitmore's channels in the past 18 months. Priya said she'd heard that and that her answer was the same. Then she ended the call. She sat at her desk for a while afterward. She hadn't told Tate about Harmon's first inquiry a week ago. She wasn't sure what she would say if she did. She pulled up the bidder contact file and added the shop number to her phone, under a label that said only Whitmore Lot 19. On day 17 she drove to the shop again. No padfolio. She parked on the street and walked in and said she'd been in the area. Tate looked at her. He looked out at the street, which ended in a dead-end cul-de-sac approximately 150 yards past his driveway. He looked back at her. He didn't say anything. He opened the door wider. The clock case was fully restored. The movement was back inside. The case stood under the lamp with the new glass fitted and the finial sourced and installed, a match so close that you'd have to know what you were looking for to see the difference. And even then you'd have to look twice. Tate was working at the bench on a small piece of the dial restoration, fitting a repaired chapter ring back into position, and after a moment he said, without looking up, "Hold this." Priya set her bag down. She came over and put both hands where he indicated and held the ring steady while he worked the setting. They stayed that way for several minutes, her hands where he needed them, his working with a precision that had its own kind of quiet about it, the shop filling with small sounds and nothing else. When he was done he said, "Thank you." Priya didn't move right away. The clock stood between them under the lamp, and under the lamp it looked like what it was. Night 20. Sophie was at her grandmother's, and the shop was the particular kind of quiet that old buildings have when there's no one else in them. Not silence, but an absence that you can feel the edges of. Tate sat on the floor with his back against the workbench leg. Legs stretched out, looking at the clock standing on the center table. Not the posture of a man in trouble. The posture of a man doing arithmetic in his head, counting what it had cost, and what it might return, and seeing if it balanced. On the shelf behind the table, pushed back between a reference binder and a small jar of clock oil, there was a photograph in a plain frame, not prominent, not displayed. Grace, standing in the driveway of the first house they'd owned, one hand on the hood of a car that had needed substantial work, squinting against the summer light. Sophie, maybe 2 years old, on her hip. The photograph was from 2015. Grace had been the one who told him the clockwork was worth pursuing. She'd seen the first restoration he completed, a Vienna regulator that had come to him in pieces. And she'd stood in the garage and looked at it running and said, "You made something work that had stopped." She said it simply, the way she said most things. She died in the winter of 2019. Sophie had been 5. He had kept the shop. He had kept Sophie. He had kept working. His phone buzzed on the bench above him. 10:47. A message from Priya asking if he'd received the updated lot documentation from the county records office. A chain of title search she'd initiated on his behalf. Came back with something you should see, she wrote. Nothing alarming. Call when you can. He looked at the message for a long moment. He wrote back that he'd received the preliminary version and could she send the update. He looked at what he'd sent. He added, "Thank you for doing this." 3 minutes later she wrote back, "It's my job." He looked at that. Then he wrote, "No, it isn't. Not this part." She didn't reply immediately. When she did 20 minutes later, it was only no, not exactly. He set the phone face down on the floor beside him and looked at the clock in the lamplight. 270 years, give or take. Still running, or very nearly. He thought about what Sophie had said and found he didn't have an argument with it. Day 26. Everett came by in the afternoon with a folded piece of paper that he set on the bench without explanation. Tate unfolded it. A photocopy of 2 pages from a specialist journal, the Bulletin of the Antiquarian Horology Society, dated fall 2003. A paper by a historian named Pratt. The Pratt paper, the one Tate had referenced from memory. He'd read it years ago and not had a copy in the shop. Everett picked up his thermos. "I didn't find that," he said, and left. Tate read the paper twice. Then he set it flat on the bench and put a weight on the corner so it wouldn't curl. This was the document he'd been missing. Not proof on its own, but the bridge. If he could link the physical characteristics of the movement to the technical specifications in Pratt's paper and get a credentialed horological expert to examine the clock in person and put their name to an opinion, the attribution argument could stand. Not with certainty, with enough. He looked at the calendar on the wall, 16 days to the date he'd set himself. Then he looked at his phone. Priya's name still on the screen from the night before. He didn't call. He didn't put the phone away either. Day 28. Priya arrived at her office at 7:50 in the morning to find an email waiting. It had come in at 11:30 the previous night. No subject line. A single attachment, a scanned document, 12 pages. The header read, Farwell Workshop Attribution Records, Estate of James Pratt, deposited with the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, London 1994. Against each of the 9 clocks documented in Pratt's estate records, there were physical descriptors, movement configuration, escapement type, case details, dial markings. The 6th entry stopped her. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Whitmore's records consultant, with a request for authentication of the document source, and spent the rest of the morning on other work that she completed, without much memory of having done it. The consultant's response came back that afternoon. The document matched records from the Clockmakers Company archive that were accessible through their digitized collection. Legitimate, historical, not secret, just obscure, the kind of thing that would take focused research to find. She pulled the lot file. She read the movement description she'd noted during her first visit to the shop. She compared it to the 6th entry in the Pratt estate records. She sat very still for a while. Then she picked up her phone. She called the shop number, and it rang through to voicemail. She hung up without leaving a message. She thought for a moment. She texted, "I need to show you something. Are you in the shop tomorrow morning?" He replied in 4 minutes. "I'm in the shop now." She drove out that evening with her laptop and the printed pages. No prepared explanation. Tate was at the bench when she came in. She set the laptop on the cleared end of the table and opened the document and turned the screen toward him without speaking. He read it carefully. She watched his face while he did, which was not something she usually did. She usually looked at documents, not people reading documents. When he looked up, it was directly at her, without the slight deflection he'd had in every earlier visit. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It came to my office. No sender identified. The document is legitimate. I had it verified." He looked at it again, then he looked at her. "You've done more than the lot file required," he said. "Yes." It was the first time either of them had said a plain thing without framing it as something professional, and the plainness of it sat in the room for a moment. He told her about the years before Indiana, a conservatorship position at a museum in Philadelphia, which was where he'd first encountered Farwell attribution work, and the 12 clocks he'd fully restored there, 2 of which were now in private collections at values that had surprised the market when they sold. He told her about leaving Philadelphia. He told her about Grace. He said all of it without performance, in the flat, even tone of someone who has said things many times in their own head and is saying them aloud for the first time in a while, and is neither comfortable nor uncomfortable with it, just honest. Priya listened. She had learned to listen with her whole attention and not perform it, and she did that now. She heard what he said, and she heard what was underneath it, which was not sadness exactly, but a kind of steady weight that had been carried long enough to become simply the way things were. When he finished, she looked at the clock standing on the center table under the lamp. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. "Return it to where it can be seen." She didn't know precisely what he meant. She didn't ask. When she left, she stood on the driveway for a moment before getting in her car. The shop light was warm behind the window. She could hear him inside, the small sounds of tools and movement. Standing in the driveway on a Thursday evening in March, she understood that she was paying attention to something, not evaluating it, not calculating its angles, just paying attention, the way she had before she learned to do the other thing instead. She drove home and sat with it. On the evening of day 41, the clock was finished. Tate stood against the far wall with his arms folded and looked at it, case fully restored, the grain of the veneer consistent and correct under the shop light. the repaired glass invisible in its setting. The brass fittings polished to the degree that was correct, not overcleaned, which would have been worse than leaving them, and the movement running. He could hear it, not loudly, a soft, measured, deeply regular sound that was something between a pulse and a mechanism, and was, in some way he couldn't have entirely explained, both. Everett was there. He'd come by with sandwiches and had not left. He sat on his stool and listened to the clock and didn't say anything for a while. "Will you disclose the attribution at the sale?" he asked eventually. "If Priya can formalize it through Whitmore?" "Yes." Claimed attribution, supported by the Pratt documentation and an independent expert examination, disclosed fully and clearly, and if she can't, I sell it as a documented restoration of a fine English bracket clock and I fix the roof. He paused. "And Sophie gets new shoes." Everett laughed a real laugh. Tate smiled. At 9:15 that evening, Priya called. She'd spent the better part of 2 weeks working through it. The clockmaker's company document, the Pratt paper, an in-person examination by a specialist from a respected conservancy in Cincinnati, who had put his professional opinion in writing after 4 hours with the movement. The file was not definitive. It was legitimate, claimed Farwell attribution, supported by documentary evidence and independent specialist examination, disclosed per Whitmore's buyer transparency policy. More documentation than most lots in their building had ever seen. Tate listened. Then, he said, "Will Harmon cause problems for you?" A pause. The first question he'd asked that was about her and not the clock. "Probably," she said. "That's mine to manage." An hour later there was a knock. Tate opened the shop door and found Harmon Fitch in the driveway in a good coat, his hands in his pockets, looking at the clock visible on the center table through the open door. His expression went through several things in quick succession. The last one was uncomplicated want. He offered $140,000 on the spot. He was reasonable about it. He was persuasive. He explained the logic, no fees, no uncertainty, a clean transaction that served everyone. He pushed the number up when Tate didn't respond. Tate said, "You walked past it during the preview. I spent 42 days to understand what you missed." He stepped back and closed the door. He stood in the quiet for a moment. Then, from the old folding cot he'd set up in the corner, Sophie's grandmother had an early start the next morning and Sophie had needed somewhere to sleep, came a small, drowsy voice. "Dad." He went over. Sophie was sitting up, blanket around her shoulders, looking at the clock on the table with the focused expression of someone who has woken up for something specific. "That's the clock." She looked at it seriously. "It's loud. It's quiet, actually. Not if the room is quiet." She looked at it a moment more. "Is it fixed?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, with the gravity of a 9-year-old rendering a considered verdict. "It sounds like it knows what it's doing," she said. She lay back down and was asleep again before he'd stood up fully. Tate put his hand on her shoulder for a moment. Then he walked to the clock and stood in front of it and listened. Saturday morning. The Whitmore auction house on Caldwell Street was full in a way it rarely was for a regional sale. Not standing room, but close. The parking lot had plates from out of county from 2 states over. People who didn't come to Claremont for ordinary sales were there with bitter paddles already in hand, talking in the low, focused way of collectors who think something real might be happening. Priya had listed the clock 3 days earlier with full documentation, high-resolution photographs including interior movement images, the independent examination report, the Pratt Journal excerpt, and the clockmaker's company document. She had written the description herself, carefully, with the specific language that said exactly what was known and exactly what wasn't, and left no room for misrepresentation in either direction. Harmon Fitch had called her office twice that week. She had not taken either call. The clock came to the floor at 11:12. The room went quiet. The real kind of quiet, not the polite pause between lots, but the quiet of a room that has encountered the thing it was told might be here, and is now deciding what to do about it. Under the auction house lights, on the low platform, the clock stood and ran. You could not hear it from the floor, but several people in the front rows leaned forward without meaning to. Priya called the opening at 65,000. 4 paddles went up immediately. The room moved quickly to 180, then slowed into the focused back and forth of buyers who have made their decisions and are executing them. At 230,000 it narrowed to 2. Harmon Fitch, who had the particular stillness of a man who had decided he was not going to lose, and a buyer from the third row, whose registration listed a private acquisition firm in New York that Priya didn't recognize but that had arrived with a letter of credit that Whitmore's financial desk had reviewed and found sufficient. 240, 255, 270, 285. Harmon raised his paddle, held it at 290. Priya watched the room. He found Tate in the back, same position as 42 days ago. Back wall, hands in his pockets, watching the clock and not the bidders. The New York buyer's paddle went up. 300. Harmon looked at the clock. He looked at his paddle. He set it on his knee. Priya gave the room 10 seconds. 300,000 going once. She paused. Going twice. The room was perfectly still. She brought the gavel down. The room broke into applause, uneven at first and then spreading. Harmon Fitch rose from his seat and left without speaking to anyone. Not hurrying, but not stopping. People watched him go. Priya signed the sales sheet and looked up. Tate was looking at her from across the room. Not smiling, just looking, with the steadiness of a man who had said something clearly and was watching it be received. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her paperwork, and was aware that something had shifted, though she couldn't have said with precision where it had happened, or when she'd stopped watching it happen and started being inside it. The crowd thinned over the following hour. Tate signed the settlement at the side table. After Whitmore's commission and fees, $247,000 landed in an account that had been running on careful arithmetic for 4 years. He stood in the hallway looking at the number on the form and let out a slow breath. It wasn't the number, it was the fact of it. The proof that what he'd seen in a low-light photograph on his kitchen table 6 weeks ago had been real, and that seeing it had meant something, and that the work had been worth exactly what it had cost him. Harmon came down the hall. He stopped in front of Tate and looked at him without the edge he'd carried in every previous interaction. He looked like a man doing an honest accounting. "You knew when you walked in," Harmon said. "I had a strong suspicion from the photograph, the motion work configuration in the image corner." Harmon studied him. "I looked at the same catalog, same photograph." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know to look for that." He said it plainly without pleasure in it. Then he nodded once, the particular nod of a person acknowledging something they can't unknow, and walked on. Priya found Tate by the side door a few minutes later with the settlement envelope and the formal closeout papers. She handed them to him. "You didn't tell me about Philadelphia," she said. "When I first asked about the clock, you didn't ask directly. I looked you up." "I know the second visit." She stopped. "When did you know?" "The first visit. You asked about the escapement type and the motion work arrangement. That's not a question someone asks without having done specific reading." She looked at him, the particular expression of a person who is used to being the one who has prepared, encountering someone who noticed the preparation from the moment she walked through the door. She had thought she had the advantage. He had seen it and said nothing for 8 days. She didn't have an answer for that. That was genuinely unusual. The main doors opened and Sophie came in at a run, her grandmother right behind her, still in her coat. Sophie went directly to her father. "How much?" she said. "Enough for new shoes." Sophie narrowed her eyes in the way that meant she was evaluating whether this was an acceptable answer. And the roof, and maybe a sign outside. Sophie appeared to find this reasonable. Then she looked at Priya with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a 9-year-old who has no particular reason to be anything other than direct. "You're the one who sold my dad's clock," she said. "I held the gavel," Priya said. Sophie thought about this seriously. "That's the important part," she said. Tate looked at Priya, and for the first time without anything guarded around it, he smiled. 3 weeks later, the shop had a different project on the center table. A long-case clock from an estate in Muncie, brought in by a family who'd had it in their hallway for 50 years without knowing what they had. Bread and butter work, but interesting, the kind of job that took knowledge and patience and repaid both. Tate was at the bench when Everett appeared in the doorway. "Someone called," Everett said. He was holding a slip of paper, a museum conservator, Philadelphia. "They heard about the Farwell through the clockmaker's company Grapevine and they want to talk. Something about a consulting arrangement." He set the slip on the bench. "I told them I'd pass it along." Tate looked at the slip. He looked at the long case clock. He picked up the slip and set it in his breast pocket and went back to work. He was still at the bench 20 minutes later when he heard a car in the lot. Not Everett's. He knew Everett's. He heard the door. Then footsteps on the concrete, which he also knew by now. Priya came in without knocking, which she had apparently stopped doing. She had nothing in her hands. No padfolio, no bag, no professional prop of any kind. She stood in the middle of the shop in her coat and looked at him at the bench. "The Philadelphia Conservancy called my office," she said, "to confirm the lot documentation was authentic for their records. Everett just told me. They asked who was the right person to speak with about your work history." She paused. "I said I'd find out." Tate was quiet for a moment. "They asked you. They asked whoever might know." A shorter pause this time. "I'm not entirely sure how I became that person." The shop was quiet. Not the tense quiet of two people at cross purposes. The quiet of two people standing in the same place, arriving at the same understanding at roughly the same moment, which is a different thing entirely. "There's a Howard in the back," Tate said, "that I haven't started yet. From 1871, if you wanted to see." It was not a complicated question. It was the question of a man who wanted a reason for someone to stay. Priya looked toward the back of the shop. "What's a Howard?" "Edward Howard, Boston. Post-Civil War production. High-quality movement, undervalued by most buyers because the case design isn't fashionable." "Are you telling me because you think I should know, or because you want me to stay?" She met his eyes. "Both," he said. Priya put her bag down on the bench. She walked toward the back of the shop. Tate followed. The door behind them stayed open. The late afternoon light came through at the low angle that March light has in the Midwest when the season is turning, and it laid two long shadows across the concrete floor, longer than the people who made them, and going in the same direction. Neither of them had been looking for this. But the thing about good work is that it tends to find its own level, and so, it turns out, does everything else.